With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. I'm Andrew Donaldson. Thank you so much for giving us the most precious thing you have, your time. That's why we do what we do on this program. We turn down the noise in the news cycle, try to stick to the things that matter, try to skip the things that don't, talk to knowledgeable guests, deal with the things that are important, because we're trying to discern the times we live in just a little bit better. Now, you may have heard tell we're getting ready to have an election next week. So pretty much now for the next 10, 12 days or however longer, because we're probably going to have a couple of runoffs in there too, and somebody's going to contest elections. You know how these things go. We're going to be talking elections a lot lately. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, by the way, we're going to have a big election preview show on Monday's episode. Let's take a little big picture perspective about a few things, because here's the deal. Every election now is the most important election of your lifetime. The republic will fall if whatever party is paying for the ad you're watching at the particular moment doesn't win a clean sweep of every single office. If you do not vote exactly how people tell you to do, democracy will come to a screeching halt immediately. Grandma will get thrown off a cliff because she won't get benefits anymore. And of course, you are not an American because you didn't vote a certain way. If you don't believe me, just look at your social media, your Facebook page, whatever. Somebody will tell you that. It's, of course, all noise and nonsense. Yes, it's your duty to vote. Yes, it's your duty to be an informed voter. But let's just calm down here a little bit. Every election of my lifetime has been the most important election of my lifetime. I got news for you. As soon as we're done with this one, we're going to start on 2024, and that's a presidential year. So that's really going to be the most important election of your lifetime until we get to 2026. And that'll be the most important election of your lifetime. Do you see the scam here? It's a shell game. It's just to keep you maximally engaged in giving money and supporting your candidates. And there's nothing wrong with those things in and of themselves. But let's talk a little bit about some perspective here. We've had a little bit of an odd historical run here lately. President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden all came into the presidency controlling nominally, and I know that we got a 50-50 Senate, but with the tiebreak, they all came into power controlling all three branches of government with their political parties. But that's a bit of an outlier. I want to back up to a piece out of Pew Research Center. It gives a little perspective on this. This is from Kathleen Schaefer. This is from February of last year. In an era marked by deep and intense partisan divides, single-party control of the executive and legislative branches might seem rare, but unified government at the beginning of a president's first term has actually been the norm, especially for Democratic presidents going back to the 56th Congress. That would be, for those of you that don't want to do the math, 1899 to 1901. So this is going back a ways. In fact, it's been the case for 16 of 21 presidents, dating to Theodore Roosevelt, the 5 exceptions: George W. and George H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, Gerald Ford, and Richard Nixon. Single-party control of Congress has been a very interesting thing. The current Senate is notable because it's evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, giving Democrats narrow control because of the Vice President Harris's tiebreak. Although a single party in charge in Washington is common at the beginning of a new president's term, there's only been one presidency since 1969 where control lasted beyond the first midterm election. That was Democratic President Jimmy Carter's one term in office. When Democrats retained leadership of the House and Senate in both the 95th and 96th Congresses, that'd be 78 and 80 respectively. Republican George W. Bush also enjoyed single-party control for several years, but not at the beginning of his tenure. It was in later on. Donald Trump and Barack Obama and Bill Clinton all entered office with the House and Senate led by their parties. In each of those presidencies, at least one chamber flipped in the following midterm. For example, during the 94 midterms following Clinton election, of course, that would be the Contract with American, Newt Gingrich-led Republican uprising. Both houses switched from Democrat to Republican majority. Between the turn of the century and the 70s, one-party control of legislative and executive branches often lasted several consecutive congressional sessions. The longest stretch was 26 years. Republican led all three from March 21 to March of 1933. Boy, we're going back in the vault for that stat, when Democrats took over and then maintained power all the way through 47. Since then, The longest period of leadership for any one party has been only 8 years, when Democrats maintained one-party control from the beginning of John F. Kennedy's term to the end of Lyndon B. Johnson's. Of course, he was assassinated while the carryover there. In the 27 congressional sessions following LBJ's presidency, one-party control has existed for only 8 total sessions of Congress. We're going to hear a lot about wave elections. We're expecting to have a red wave election. But remember, the last midterm was a red wave election, but it was a blue wave. 2018 was a blue wave election by any definition. You can just go off the numbers. The House was a plus 41D pickup, 41 seats for the Democratic Party, and they took control. And Nancy Pelosi started her second stint as Speaker of the House. It was a wave election, and it only lasted 4 years. It only lasted 2 more elections, 2 more Congresses. It wasn't permanent. Nothing ever is in politics. So when we talk about a red wave, just remember that's not permanent either. Every single one of those congressional seats are going to be up in 2 years, in a presidential year, and in a presidential year that is shaping up to be like nothing we've ever seen before, depending on who does and does not run. What we do know, voter turnout has been up each of the last few elections. Voter intensity is up. The money is way up involved. So it's going to be a very, very intense 2024, probably the most intense we've ever seen. Is it the most consequential of our lifetime? Everybody's going to tell us so. But I just want to bring the perspective before we start talking about wave elections and how well one party did and how bad the other party did. In 2018, we were talking about the blue wave. 2022, the very next midterm, we're talking about a red wave. And depending on how this Congress performs, they could get swept out again. Remember, every 2 years, the entire House is up for a vote, a third of the Senate, and every 4 years, the presidency. And underneath that, you have governors, attorneys generals, Senate, House, legislatives, assemblies, whatever your state has, local elections. I told you last week when I did my early voting, 75% of my ballot easily was judges. There's a lot more to elections, and these wave elections are fleeting. Like all waves, they come and they go. They come on the shore. Depending on how big a wave it is, they may leave an impact, but they always, always recede back into the political ocean, and the next wave comes, and it will probably be the other party, because these things tend to go a little bit in cycles. So keep your bearing and keep your perspective over the next couple of weeks. Yes, the Republicans are in line to do very, very well. The Democrats look like they're going to take a shellacking this time around. But it was only a few elections ago the shoe was on the other foot. And it'll probably only be, historically, cyclically, common sense-wise, it'll only be a few more elections before they are again. So keep your bearing. These things are temporary. Don't be building mortar brick houses on the shifting sands of wave elections and national narratives. They will get swept away. More Hertel right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, the most appearances on the program in history. The streak continues and extends. Dr. Michael Siegel, that's the DR, real kind of smart doctor with letters after his name for those of you from Logan. Friend of the program, Ordinary Times contributor. He flies spacecraft. He teaches young minds. He does all sorts of things. Michael, how's you, sir?
I am good. How are you today?
I'm hanging in there. Let's start terrestrially, if that's still a word. I'm not sure if it is or not. Your latest throughput. Every Thursday, he does a science feature for Ordinary Times. This is one we've gone over before, but it's gotten new life the last couple of weeks. The COVID lab leak theory. Of course, we all know about the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We know about wet markets. We heard that. We've debated this for, 2 years now?
Yep.
But you had to write about it because there's been some new developments that have really thrown fuel on the fire, as you say.
Yeah, there was a Republican report from the Senate staffers this week that said that they thought that the lab leak theory was more likely than not to be true. And Vanity Fair, ProPublica did a publication that was based partly on that report and also from diplomatic messages that and from the Chinese government that seem to indicate some very big problems with the operations of the Wuhan Institute. Now, we've been getting hints of that for a while, but so far there's not been a smoking gun. What you have with the lab leak theory is a lot of suggestions, and just starting from the fact that it's the Wuhan Institute and the outbreak happened in the city of Wuhan. Now, Wuhan is a massive city, and the wet markets have been previously identified as a potential source of a viral outbreak. So that's not completely definitive. But when you dig into the Republican report, and especially when you dig into the ProPublica report, it's still just a lot of conjecture. There's no real solid evidence. We do know that Wuhan had problems with their BSL-4, biosafety level 4 facility, but that's not unusual. That's not really new news. This summer, there were 2 papers published in Science, though, that looked at the COVID-19 virus from a biological perspective, looked at its DNA, looked at its evolution, and they concluded that a zoonotic outbreak, an outbreak from a bat or a pangolin or something like that, was far more likely than a lab leak. We're probably unlikely to know for sure, and we're especially unlikely to know for sure because China has been very opaque on this issue. Their investigations have been kind of cursory and secretive, and they're not really sharing the kind of information that they need to share so we can definitively nail this down. And we might not, even if they were, we might not know for sure. So I would say that this is a lot of smoke, but not a lot of fire. A lot of conjecture and suggestion that plays into a lot of people's priors on this. One of our commenters pointed out, the idea that the virus broke out randomly from a wet market is scarier than the idea that this was a lab leak, something that could be more easily prevented. But in the end, the evidence still weighs heavily on a zoonotic origin. It's not, I would say, the lab leak is not a conspiracy theory if you're talking about a lab leak. If you're talking more of the pandemic, Bill Gates did this so we could all have 5G chips installed in us or whatever, that's a conspiracy theory. But I think while the lab leak theory is not ruled out, it's very unlikely at this point.
Yeah, Dr. Michael Siegel joining us. Here's how I break down news stories, and this is where I have a problem with this one. How we get the news is usually just about as important as the bit of news we're getting, right?
Mhm.
So we have a couple parts here, and you already touched on one of them. We can't trust anything coming out of China because we know they lie, cheat, and steal because they're a dictatorship that are obsessed over information control and image.
That's why we had the outbreak in the first place, because they
Right.
spent a lot of time denying that this thing was communicable to humans. I mean, we might not have contained it anyway, but that certainly didn't help.
Yeah, so we've got the China piece. You mentioned this is Republican staffers, but it was put out into the media, the mass media, by Vanity Fair and ProPublica. These are not 2 organizations that are normally really super friendly to Republicans and or right-wing political entities. ProPublica is very open about being activist journalists. They actually do really good investigative work. They're biased, just program that in, but when they investigate something, it's usually pretty solid. They know what they're doing. Vanity Fair, of course, is a very progressive liberal publication. Normally, when they agree with something from the right, you would go, okay, well, these folks don't usually get along. There should be something to that. That kind of piqued my interest. So if there's a lot of smoke and no fire, why are we having these convergences, do you think? Because that does get people's attention. That lends credibility for some folks, but are they all just chasing threads, or is there some there?
I think that if this did turn out to be a lab leak, it would be one of the biggest news stories ever. People talk about media bias and the media burying stories. If a left-leaning organization were to discover the smoking gun and say this absolutely came from Wuhan, they'd win a Pulitzer Prize. It'd be the biggest story of the year that this came from the lab. And it's not, an unreasonable supposition. We have had outbreaks from labs before. The last person to die of smallpox got it from a lab leak in the UK. We've had outbreaks specifically of the SARS virus in China and Singapore from people doing research on it. It didn't spread because it was contained, and it wasn't COVID-19, which was way more infectious. But we have had these outbreaks. So it's not that unreasonable a theory. I think and this is still very early days. There's still a lot of debate going on about the ProPublica piece. I think they may have jumped the gun a little bit. There are a lot of people saying that they mistranslated the Chinese documents or misunderstood them. And certainly interpreting government documents from a government like China is very difficult. And there are a number of other people. There was a virologist who went on Twitter and put out all his criticisms of the piece that they didn't wait for before they published. So I think that they anticipated this was going to be a big story and may have jumped the gun here.
Yeah, Dr. Michael Siegel joined us. You and I talked a lot because you were kind of our go-to COVID guy during the COVID pandemic at Ordinary Times. By the way, we're linking to both the Vanity Fair and ProPublica piece and also the congressional report. Read it all for yourself. Same thing Michael says in his piece. Read the whole thing for yourself. Make up your own mind. We're discussing this as if you've read it. Make sure you do your homework here because there's a lot of details involved. But we talked a lot about one of the things that really made the pandemic a mess was communication. We learned really quick that scientists and the common folk don't communicate real good. Academics don't communicate real good. Doctors don't communicate real good. And any of those three that are also government bureaucratic officials, they really don't communicate very good, right? We've established that. So you understand where people are coming from with this when it's like, well, hey, when we brought this up in the early days, you were deplatformed. You were told, no, you're crazy. Don't even ask this question. And now we're coming back to this. You understand where people get a little skittish with this stuff because of the way it was communicated, because of the way it was handled, believe the science, all that mess that we've talked over and over and over again until we're sick of it for 2 years. This isn't in a vacuum. This story's getting more life because of the way people treated it, because of the way people manipulated it, and because of the way you said it before, the way people put their priors on it before. This isn't in a vacuum. This is a sequence of events that brought us back to this story yet again, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think that the lab leak theory was dismissed early on and with far more certainty than it warranted. Certainly, there was a lot of junk science being done that they said proved the lab theory, like, oh, these sequences only have a 1 in X chance of occurring. Well, that's why we don't get disease breaks every year. Or there were I think a lot of people were concerned that validating the lab leak hypothesis would link to really crazy conspiracy theories about a pandemic, or that China was using this as a bioweapon against the West or something like that. But I think that there was a necessity, and I wrote about it at the time, to divide between people saying this may have leaked from a lab by accident or even on purpose versus this was some giant, vast conspiracy to kill millions of people or make Bill Gates rich or whatever their conspiracy was. I do agree that there was far too early, I don't want to say far too aggressive dismissal of lumping this in with conspiracy theories rather than what it was, which was legitimate question of, hey, there's a virology institute just in this same city that researches coronaviruses. Is there a chance that these are related? All right, it now appears that it's unlikely, but I don't think you can ever rule it out. And so while I would say pandemic conspiracy theories are disinformation or whatever, or crazy, I would say that saying this came from a lab leak is, while not favored by the evidence, is not a crackpot theory at all.
Dr. Michael Siegel. Let's get to the core of this as far as we're involved, the common folks on our social media, in the commentariat. This really gets to the core of how do we discuss something as complicated as this. When it comes to this disease, you've talked about it before on this program. Good science is okay with getting questioned. It's like good religion is good with getting questioned. Good politics is good with getting questioned. One of your signs of integrity is, are you okay with getting questions and handling tough questions? We just touched on the whole, believe the science. You're not allowed to ask any questions. That's not good science. At the same time, there's some line in there where you depart from, honest questions, honest skepticism. I'll say healthy skepticism, because healthy skepticism is a core part of science, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where's the line when we're discussing this stuff of, okay, we need to be, discerning of what we're being told here, but it's maybe a topic we don't know a lot about before we descend into, crack pottery, as you so aptly called it, the conspiracy theory, all the noise and nonsense out there. Where's that line? How do we tiptoe up to it, and how do we don't cross it, Professor?
That is a very good and difficult question. I would say look for when people start trying to attribute motives or trying to hammer it into a political frame. That science concerns itself with questions of fact. And when you start expanding that to motives and trying to ram it into whatever frame you want it to be in, that's where you're going more towards the crack pottery side. So to return to the lab leak theory, asking legitimate scientific questions. Did this come from a lab? Was this related to lab research? These are factual questions. You're trying to ascertain facts. Can we look at this virus's gene code and see that it was engineered? Can we look at the pattern of the outbreak and see that it was related to the Wuhan Institute? These are things that have definitive answers. Where you go into conspiracy theories is when you say, well, I think China wanted to do this. I think Bill Gates wanted to do this. I think the big pharma companies wanted to do this. When you start attributing motives, that's where you're leading more and more into conspiracy theory and really mind reading and so forth. When you're trying to cram this into a political frame of anti-big pharma or anti-Republican or anti-Democrat, that's where you start leaning more and more into conspiracy theories when you get away from the facts and more towards speculation.
Yeah, Dr. Michael Siegel joining us as he often does. This is where it gets back into politics, though, because you cannot take the political angle out of this. Like we just said, our public health system, we've learned it the hard way. We like to think it's an independent organization. It's not. It's a political entity because it's funded by the government and it's a bureaucracy and there's politics involved. Let's just all be adults. We're dealing with China. That's a geopolitical foe. That is not a fair player. That is not an honest dealer of information and or anything else because they're an adversary in a lot of ways. That's where the politics of this comes in, and there's no way to separate that. So how do we deal with that? Because even as we're trying to find scientific truth, look, all those scientists in China, they're all connected because they don't get those jobs unless they're connected, right? Let's all be honest. So how do we deal with the political part of this? Because as we've learned now, public health has a political component that we're just going to have to learn how to deal with here.
I think we have to kind of try as best we can to keep the science as a separate issue, focusing science on the facts and less on interpretation. This was something that actually Anthony Fauci talked about a little earlier on, before sort of he became this figure in the media. His job as a scientist was to inform the politicians of things from a scientific point of view, and their job was to balance things and consider the political consequences. If the scientists had their way, for example, you would have shut down the entire country for like 3 weeks. But the politicians had to say, that's not going to work. What can we do? What's doable? What's workable? And so I think you have to think of the political sphere as sort of having science as a component of that, informing the debate. But ultimately, the political sphere has to take into account in diplomacy with China. It has to take into account economics. It has to take into account other factors. I wrote a piece a while ago about this. There was a piece about how we should have this rationalia, a society entirely determined by rational principles. And I pointed out that doesn't really work because many of the questions we deal with are moral questions or economic questions that don't have a scientific answer. You take the abortion issue, for example. Science can tell you when certain fetal developments happen, but it can't answer the moral question of when is a fetus a human being? When does it have a right to live? That's a moral question that we are debating very fiercely right now. And so when you talk about something like a pandemic, we can inform people what this disease does, how it spreads, how lethal it is, what are the long-term consequences of an infection, how well do these treatments work, how well do these vaccines work. But ultimately, that is feeding into the political question of, all right, what policies do we have in place?
Right. Dr. Michael Siegel. I don't like to get into the Fauci stuff because he became an avatar for whatever everybody wanted him to be.
Yeah.
But since you brought it up, I got to say it. Here's where the problem comes with that is if you're a just the facts scientist, you can't go on TV and do commentary because the second you start doing commentary, you've lost the science. And then when you put the science hat back on and go, oh no, I'm just a scientist. No, that's not how that works. You're one or the other. You don't get to go back and forth. It's not, science hat on, science hat off. That's where that becomes a problem, especially if you're going to be the guy and that guy. I think folks like Fauci, some of the criticism's unwarranted, some of them's very fair. If you're going to be in that role and you're going to be the highest paid government employee we got on that matter, and you're the expert, you've got to be aware of that, don't you?
I think so. There's one of the things I like to say is, and again, return to this idea of a science-based run society. When you mix science and politics, the result tends to not be to scientize the politics, but to politicize the science.
Does politics always win when it's science? Not to interrupt you, but does politics always win when it's politics versus science? Because it sure looks like it is right now.
It feels like that a lot, and it gets very difficult. And just to give an example of where the politics crossed the science in this particular case, when the George Floyd protests started, there was a letter that came out from a bunch of scientists saying, well, the anti-lockdown protests were bad and people shouldn't have done that because that could spread COVID. But these protests are good, so we should allow them even though there's a risk of spreading COVID. And I wrote an article for Ordinary Times saying, this is really, really bad. You're destroying your credibility here because you can't say that our scientific opinion is changing based on politics. You do have to cross over sometime. I've commented sometimes on the science, and I've sometimes commented on the policy. As sort of a blogger and a writer, and being on Twitter. But you have to be very careful when you cross over those roles, because if there is a perception that your politics are informing the science, you're really damaging your credibility.
Yeah, Michael Siegel joining us. This all happened about the same time that Emily Oster piece came out in The Atlantic. If you don't know what we're talking about, we both read it. I've already commented on it. You've heard my comments on it, so I'll let you rebut here in just a second. The piece was Let's Declare a Pandemic Amnesty. We dealt with it on this program. You can go back and listen to that episode from a couple of days ago. Basically, and by the way, the title was horrible. You need to actually read the piece, to be fair to her. I have found her to be mostly level-headed throughout the pandemic on most things. There's some things I don't agree, but she's not been a bomb thrower. I think she's been mostly even-handed. She goes through this pretty, look, the education stuff was bad. The government stuff was bad. People not listening about the vaccines was bad. I think she's pretty even-handed. I think the title kind of throws people off. They react to the title, didn't read the whole piece. Having said that, the title poses a question that we must deal with, and I've dealt with it. Let's declare a pandemic amnesty. So when something about the same time the fuel's getting thrown on the lab leak fire, this goes into my take on it, and I'll just summarize it real quick, and then I'll give you the floor on it. My take on it was, well, it depends. Are you talking about people that made an honest mistake? Are you talking about people that just didn't know any better and adjusted as they went to the information? Is it people that made a mistake and said, hey, I messed up, I didn't know any better? Of course, those people should get some grace and get some forgiveness. But there's a lot of malicious people that use this for a lot of different reasons that don't have one little iota of regret. No, I don't think they should get amnesty, because you need accountability for this stuff. And when you're talking about something like a lab leak theory or the origin theories, that's why you look at that, because you want to prevent this from happening again, and you don't get that without accountability. So I can't get on board with a blanket amnesty, even though I think we all should treat each other a little bit better. Your thoughts after reading the piece and hearing my commentary?
Well, I agree with a lot of what you said. A lot of people had not read the piece, and more of them are not familiar with who Emily Oster is. She is, if you're jumping on her, you're shooting your own side. She was one of the first ones to say we should be reopening schools. She was saying that in summer 2020. She was saying, she's an economist, and she said, looking at the data, it does not look like we're getting a lot of spread in schools. Now, there's a caveat to that. There were mitigations. There was improvements in ventilation, masking, and especially once vaccines came out about 6 months later, that really made it easier to put people back in school. So she was one of the good guys. You don't really be jumping on her. And as you point out, she's also talking about the early days. People forget what it was like 2.5 years ago, that this was kind of terrifying, that we had this disease coming out. We didn't know a lot about it. We knew it was very infectious. We knew it killed. And in the early days, we probably did overreact because we didn't want to happen in the United States what happened in Italy. People like to say, well, COVID only kills 1% of the people who catch it, which as though that 1% is not a lot. But that's if you're getting first-rate medical care. In Italy, you remember when they really got hit hard, they were doing triage. They were saying, this person's 80 years old, we're just going to let them die. We don't have the resources to treat everyone. This person's morbidly obese, we're going to let them die. We don't have the resources to treat everyone. And a lot of the restrictions early on were to prevent that situation from happening in America, which it did. We did not get to quite that point of triage. Now, we know that some of those were arbitrary and kind of stupid, like, she talks about beaches being shut down. Beaches were one of the safest places you could be. We didn't really know that at the time, but in retrospect, that was dumb. A lot of things were kind of arbitrary and capricious, but if you think having arbitrary, capricious overreactions to a public danger is unique to COVID, I would suggest that you're not terribly familiar with the history of American politics. We do this with everything. And that plugs into sort of what you were saying, that this exposed the way we react to issues, that we have a tendency to say, we must do something. This is something. Let's do it. Oh, you don't want to do it? Then you don't want to do anything. And so I think we did need a more vigorous debate on these subjects. Schools, it wasn't obvious that schools could be kept open because, I'm just getting over a cold my son brought home from school. But it does appear that we could reopen schools. And I remember I was teaching at Penn State in fall of 2020, and a lot of people were telling me this is going to be a disaster. We're going to have mass casualties. We're going to shut down the school in 5 weeks and so forth. And we didn't. We did have a lot of students get sick, some of them seriously, but between masking and eventually vaccinations and central quarantine for students who were exposed and lots of testing, we were able to keep in-person schooling from the beginning of it till Thanksgiving break. And that was a learning lesson for us that, yes, we can control this without sending everyone home. I also think people didn't anticipate what a disaster online learning was going to be. We've been doing online learning for a while, especially in colleges. I mean, you did online classes for your education and you had good things to say about them in some cases. I don't think anyone anticipated just how bad it was going to be. So later decisions are a lot more debatable. Oster was advocating for opening schools in the fall. I think it could have made a good case then. By spring, when we had most of the teachers vaccinated, you absolutely could have opened schools. And so I think we should have a really good discussion about that. But I would point out to a lot of the people jumping on Oster and a lot of people criticizing the early decision making, if we start holding people accountable for things they said and did during COVID, it's not going to go the way you think. We're going to be talking about holding people accountable who said this was just the flu. We're going to be holding people accountable who, were vaccine and continue to lie about the vaccine, saying they're unsafe. There is now a very good scientific paper out showing that red areas of the country had much higher death rates than blue areas of the country, even when you correct for differences in age, because they were way less vaccinated. And that was a lot of vaccine skepticism that was pushed by a lot of the people jumping on Emily Oster and saying she's wrong and she's crazy and she's stupid, that they pushed this vaccine skepticism, which killed conservatively tens of thousands of people that didn't need to die. So we're going to talk about that kind of accountability, or are we just talking about accountability for those early days? Now, I do think they have two legitimate points when they talk about the early days of COVID and the sort of government, the sort of establishment response. One is the hypocrisy that you had, people saying you can't go to your grandmother's funeral, and then when John Lewis dies, they have a big funeral. Or people saying you can't go out to eat, and then they're having dinner at the French Laundry. Absolutely call out hypocrisy. And those people who were hypocrites absolutely need to be held accountable. And I also think that we should talk about the certainty with what a lot of these things were said. When people, the scientists less than the media, but even some of the scientists were saying, if you go to a baseball game, you're killing grandma. That was just, that kind of certainty was not warranted by the data we had at the time. And this is a dilemma for science. A lot of times, if you make it clear that we're not really sure, this is the best piece of knowledge we have, people think that you don't know what you're talking about. So that's a difficult line to thread. So I do think those are very legitimate criticisms. But plugging back into what you were saying on Tuesday, overall, I think COVID exposed a lot of the underlying problems we have in our politics and the way we discuss things. That, you and I talked about gun control a few months ago. We have one side that says, if you're against gun control, you want kids to die, or if we have the other side that it says, if you want gun control, you want tyranny. And, there's this tendency to extreme your opponent's views so that they're easier to dismiss. And so a lot of the hysteria, a lot of the certainty, all of the ad hominem was not unique or new to COVID. These are dysfunctions in our political system, dysfunctions in the way we discuss the issues. And COVID, because it was probably the biggest crisis we have had since World War II, amplified these dysfunctions.
Yeah, Dr. Michael Siegel joining us. The one that got me where I just went, okay, remember when they banned the seeds up in Michigan? You could not buy seeds to plant.
I was actually just going to mention that.
That's the one for me where I was like, okay. And remember, this is one of the first banned things. Like, this is even before I think we shut schools down. They started doing this stuff. I'm like, okay, you're just, this is masturbatory. There is no rhyme, reason, or that's the one that really got me.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, there was in Michigan, they had grocery stores open, but they had non-essential items roped off. And so someone had a picture where they'd roped off the seed aisle saying, you can't stop for seeds. And their logic was, we only want people to go to stores if they absolutely have to. We don't want them shopping. But the amount of time it takes to get seeds from a store and the amount of risk that people are exposed to is minimal. This was the big problem. And it is again, a dysfunction in our political system of not looking at cost benefit analysis. The benefit of roping off seed aisles could not be measured with the Webb telescope, but the inconvenience it caused to people was significant. And frankly, having people go outside and garden was one of the better things they could do.
It's insanity. Dr. Michael Siegel, the most appearances on this program ever. We're going to keep that going as long as we can because he's really, really sharp, and he's becoming a multimedia, multi-platform superstar with his YouTube channel. Also writes at Ordinary Time. Let folks know what you got going on, where they can follow you, all the different things you've got going on. Your latest that we talked about a little bit earlier, the throughput, that is up at ordinary-times.com as it is every Thursday. The YouTube channel, your Twitter. Also wrote a good little book, by the way. You got to go pick it up. Let everybody know what you got going on there, sir.
Sure. And Ordinary Times is a good gateway to everything I do. All my videos I post there so that people can find them. Actually, now that I have a few subscribers, you can just go to YouTube and Google my name, Michael Siegel Astronomy, and you'll find my video channel, and hopefully you'll find something there that you find interesting. Join the ongoing 2,000 comment debate over what the best spaceships in science fiction are. But yeah, that's the best way to find me is usually through Ordinary Times.
We're going to do that one where we talk about the crew and the military setup of those space captains too. I can't wait to get in on that. That's going to be a fun one. Yeah, Dr. Michael Siegel. Yeah,
he was my guest.
I just always love. We get so obsessed with you just proved it. They get so obsessed with the ships, you forget you got to have a crew to run that thing.
Yep.
Does the crew match the ship? Because then the ship doesn't work and doesn't make any sense. But we'll get into that some
Not
other
all
time.
officers either.
Hey, don't get me. Like, I'm a retired sergeant. Don't get me started on lieutenants. Like, all the lieutenants are super short. I'm like, no, lieutenants are like baby giraffes. They can't even walk in a straight line. You got to like hold them up. It's ridiculous. Like that's. See, I'm giving you all the good channel stuff. I'm not going to give it to you for free. You're going to have to subscribe to his YouTube channel. Dr. Michael Siegel. Love it, buddy. Thanks for the time, sir.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. Welcome back to Hurt Tell. Let's talk about money and politics real quick because it is an election season. No, I'm not talking about donor money, although that's part of it. Do you realize the last midterm election? I went back and looked, 2018. Do you know how much money was spent on that election? $5.7 billion. And we're on track that we're probably going to spend more than that in this midterm election. So where's all that money going? There's a thing called diminished returns. There's only so much money these campaigns can actually spend. So why is it getting more and more expensive? Well, there's a couple reasons for it. Politics is very, very big business in America. You already know that it drives a lot of the news media, including this show. We spend a lot of time talking about politics, although we're not really getting rich off it, although we'd like to. We take PayPal, DMs open. But money in politics isn't just the buzzword of, oh, evil funding money. There's a little bit of that. That's true. There's plenty of corruption. But mostly there is now a power structure in place in America where politics is just really big business. All those networks, any kind of media platform now, they get a nice bump every election season by taking in ad revenue. And in some cases, tons of it. There was a report. Remember when Michael Bloomberg ran for president for 3 months and dumped millions and millions and millions of dollars into it? He actually moved the spreadsheets on TV stations and TV networks because he dumped so much advertising money in such a short period of time. It was their own little line items. This is a boon to media, news media, the commentariat, print media, anything you want to say. If they can sell political advertisements, they're going to do really well on that. That's part of business. Then there's the consultant class, the folks that constantly have to be campaigning because that's how they make their money as professional campaigners. There's more of them than ever, and they're charging more than ever. They got to get paid. They got to show some way to get paid. So that means they have more and more metrics and more measurements and more candidates to try to lure in and hire them. And I'm fine for it. I hope they all make a lot of money. I'm all for people making money in America. Get your hustle on and do your job. I'm all for it. But that's part of where all this money's going to. And then there's the fact that these political parties love moving this money around because it helps them. There's certain ways that certain campaigns can do and move their money around. So even a long shot candidate, we've seen this with presidentials, the easiest way to see it. Even a long shot candidate, you understand the financials of a campaign, right? You can fundraise for your campaign. You sign off almost all your living expenses during a campaign off to the campaign. And then at the end of campaign, you may have some debt. But if you're really shrewd and you did well, maybe you can get an opponent to pay that off for you, or you can write it off. Or if you're really good with your money, you can hold on to that money and roll it forward into some other project. Or you can do what former President Trump's done and roll it into your legal fund. There's all kinds of ways to move money around. Money laundering would be a little too strong of a term. But if you want to move around massive amounts of money and fundraise it and be able to use it later, running a political campaign is a heck of a good way to do it and to keep it out of prying eyes. And besides, as long as you're campaigning, it looks like you're doing something, right? That's another reason there's so much money in politics. Biggest reason there's money in politics? Nobody said anything to stop it. Nobody's doing anything to stop it. You realize it's voluntary for you to give to one of these campaigns, right? Most of these political causes, political parties, and candidates do not need your donation, but we keep sending it to it. And that's your right. If you want to do that, more power to you, knock yourself out. Just understand they don't need it. And as long as we're feeding this beast, it's going to get bigger, fatter, and it's going to get hungrier. Maybe at some point, we, the public of all parties and all stripes, Maybe we should stop giving these people so much money. Make them start working for a living again. Maybe make them earn our votes and earn our contributions instead of just writing blank checks for the cause because the buzzwords are nice. That would probably change politics a lot more than any regulation would. But like a lot of things, like the sports teams where they only start changing things when the fans stop showing up and buying tickets or stop watching, that's what it'll probably take to really change politics, especially the money in it. Yeah, your small contribution probably won't make that much of a difference. But imagine if we demanded the same performance from our politicians we demanded from our sports teams and spent our money accordingly. What kind of world would that look like? More Heard Tell right after this. That'll do it for Heard Tell today. Thank you so much for watching and for listening, whether you're on the YouTube feed, the Big Talkers Facebook live feed, or on any of the podcasting platforms. Please make sure you're subscribed. Make sure you leave a comment and a rating. We really appreciate that. It lets folks know they can tune into our program and get quality stuff for their time. Make sure you share us on your own social media. We'd sure appreciate it. We got a lot of content out there, over a year's worth now. You can find something for everyone in there. We cover a lot of ground, and we proudly do so. We'll keep doing it. As long as you're out there watching and listening, we'll keep putting it out there for you. So, till we see you again on whatever way and whatever version of Heard Tell you're enjoying, wherever you and yours are, across the street or around the world, we hope you're well. We hope you're well fed. And we'll talk to you again real soon for more Heard Tell. All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.